If I don't teach my PDA child or teen, how will they ever learn? So this is a sentence I hear a lot from parents, and one that I ask myself over and over. 4 or 5 years ago, when my son had started to refuse reading with me at night and was not learning to read. So I asked myself, how will he learn to read if I don't teach him? But he was refusing any engagement around reading, and when we did accomplish reading at night, he would insist on me changing every single sentence to make it humorous and inverted, and he would climb on top of me because he was not interested in the reading itself. So I've had this worry, this deep worry that many of us have if we're raising a PDA child or teen. And then additionally, I remember the seatbelt when he was younger, where I was like, I need to teach him why the seatbelt is important. I need to teach him how to get into the seatbelt. I need to teach him how to climb into the car so that I can buckle him, because I was looking at it through a lack of understanding or a lack of skills through that lens. But he was having a nervous system response to the perception, the subconscious perception that there was a loss of autonomy, and his body was reacting in fight or flight. So he would have a surge of adrenaline and physically fight me to get him into the seatbelt and the car seat. And I remember actually trying to push him and restrain him before I understood any of this, okay? So this is a deep fear and a deep root cause of where parents get stuck when they're trying to support their PDA child or teen. And so today I want to talk about the same theme we've been talking about, which is the difference between gentle parenting or attachment parenting and caregiving for a PDA child or teen, okay? So the first thing I want to name, just so we can go to the root cause, is that there are some core underlying assumptions in every type of parenting that we can look to. So gentle parenting, attachment parenting, more positive discipline, traditional strict parenting. And the underlying assumption of our role as parents is we need to teach our kids the skills they need to live, and we must play the role of the teacher, okay? So the nuance here is that we are playing a role over the long term for modeling and being the stewards of our children's education. However, we need to look at the core assumptions and see how it's different for us, okay? So in traditional parenting, 3 assumptions. First, we need to be the teacher. What does this mean? We need to impart information on our children and teach them the skills in an explicit way from a position of authority, which is above them, okay? Second, we need to impart skills on a specific timeline so that they can develop along a typical developmental timeline and eventually be independent and, quote, functional members of society. And then third, we need to correct unwanted behavior in the moment in order to shift the behavior, extinguish it, or get rid of it. Okay, so this is true even in the most gentle parenting circles, and that's okay, because gentle parenting is parenting, and what we're doing here is parenting and caregiving. Okay, it's different. So let's flip these assumptions and look at them through the PDA lens. Okay, so instead of thinking of ourselves as the teacher or the authority that has to impart information, we want to start thinking about the long game of establishing a sense of felt safety and trust and viewing ourselves as mentors, collaborators, and stewards or guides. Okay, so not this type of dynamic where I'm the teacher, I'm telling you what to do, but rather this type of dynamic, okay? Or even this type of dynamic where they're teaching us, okay? But it takes a while to get there, and I'm going to talk about that. The second assumption, which might be triggering to hear, but instead of we have to push these things on a certain timeline so that they're fully independent, we want to be thinking through the lens of neurodivergence and disability, okay? So our kids are going to have spiky development. They might be really high in some areas cognitively, but still needing to use a pacifier or a diaper, right? There's going to be spikiness. There's also going to be slower timelines for certain things, right? I often think through the lens of like, even though my son is totally, at grade level or beyond in math, for example, his self-regulation skills might be 2 years behind. And that is typical or normal in our sphere, right? Which is not just the parenting sphere, it's the parenting and caregiving sphere. And then additionally, we want to be thinking about interdependence. And this is where the triggering comes in, and this is a mindset shift and brings up grief for a lot of parents. However, we want to be really thinking through the nervous system disability lens, even if it's fluctuating, because the level of complete independence, which especially in the US, our society is so focused on, might look more like interdependence or needing more support than you did as an adult or your peers' children may as an adult. That's just the reality, okay? And then the third is, instead of correcting the behavior in the moment, we want to refrain from correcting in the moment because our children cannot actually process learning because they're in this red part of the brain, which is the amygdala or the survival part of the brain, where the brain cannot process things like cause and effect, rational learning, access, empathy, connection, etc. Okay? The key here too is that many of our children, it's not just in the moment when they're behaving poorly, in quotation marks. The moment might be a year of burnout. It might be a year of reestablishing the relationship between you two from a place of felt safety. Because if we correct in the moment, it drives them further into the survival brain where they cannot learn, okay? So it's a paradox, and we're going to talk about this. Okay, so let's go to the next level of the deep why of why this is different, right? Because of the unique brain and neuroception that our children have, right? So I want to distinguish and oversimplify for all of us two parts of the brain, right? There's the prefrontal cortex, which is the blue part, and that is the most highly developed part of our brains, the most evolved. And that's where we can access things like not thinking black and white and understanding nuance, where we can access connection, where we can be empathetic, where we have a lot of our communication skills, where we can understand cause and effect. And then we have the amygdala and the limbic system, which is operating on a pre-perceptual level, a subconscious level. This is where neuroception of threat is happening. And our children's neuroception of threat is going off all the time. Anytime there is a neurocepting, anytime it is a pre-perceptual awareness of, in the body, of, oh, this person is above me, or I don't have freedom and choice or autonomy in the moment. Okay, so this is what's happening all the time, even if the child isn't aware of it. Okay, so I'm going to use a bunch of examples to ground this because I know that I started off a little bit in the clouds with like big words and stuff, but I'm going to ground it, but I wanted us to understand all of the assumptions. Okay, so think of the two parts of the brain, and it's just which part of the brain is my child in? Are they in the part that they can learn? Or are they in the part where they're having a survival response just like you would if you were held up in a dark alley or in a car crash? You're not going to be able to like necessarily even register what people are saying to you, right? If your nervous system is in fight, flight, freeze, or collapse. Okay, so I remember the first time I like had this intuitive pang, probably about 5.5, even 6 years ago, when I was still working at a large nonprofit in DC, and my boss was talking to me about my 3-year-old son, Cooper, and he was like, yeah, I love watching kids at that age. They're such sponges. They're just absorbing everything and learning so much. And I remember inside, I thought, that's not what's happening at all. My son is like a brick. Like nothing seems to be getting in. And I know he's intelligent, but he's not absorbing anything, right? So that was like a little intuitive hunch that I know you guys have too, but you might not trust. And then I started to see these patterns of like where my son would ask for help with like scissors. He'd be having trouble like cutting something with scissors. And he'd be like, I need help, really upset. And I'd go over and I'd start helping, and he would reflexively push my hand away, but then ask for help, right? And so it was like the frontal lobe or the prefrontal cortex was like, I need help with the scissors. And then his survival perception was like equalizing against my hand because I was in the position of authority. So it was like I could see these, like this cognitive loop of the two parts of the brain. Again, didn't understand it because I was like, you're asking for help, why are you pushing my hand away? Okay, so let's talk about the logic of what we can do and the long game with our PDA children and teens, because that's really the timeline we're working on. Okay, so the assumption we want to be working through is, to alleviate our own anxiety as well, is often, if not always, the child or teen, PDA child or teen, has the skills that they need already, and we don't need to teach them to them. They just can't access the skills. Okay, and this is why you see moments where it's like, you know, your kid can tie their own shoes or pack their own backpack, but they seem to not be able to, or they say, I can't do it, or they just growl or resist or avoid. And if they don't know the skills already, they often can learn them efficiently from the correct part of the brain if that's where they're operating from. Okay, but so often with therapists, teachers, parenting, we're doubling down on this idea that there's this lack of skills and we need to teach. And in that act, we're putting ourselves above them and pressuring them, and they're perceiving threat and diving deeper into the part of the brain where they absolutely can't learn what we're trying to teach. Instead of the logic of, my job is to support my child through accommodations that are based on this unique neuroception and nervous system as consistently as possible to get them back into the part of their brain consistently where they can learn, connect, empathize, communicate, right? It's a very different lens. And through that place of felt safety, work from a place of true connection and trust, which is where a lot of this learning that we want our children to have will happen. Okay? So those are the two primary things that like everything I teach is going towards as a goal. Okay, but let's talk about how hard this is. Our child qualifies for special education in reading or a learning disability, and they're super behind their peers. Okay, so where does our mind go as a mom or a dad or a parent? They're never going to catch up. They're never going to learn. They're going to have low self-concept because they're behind. They're not going to graduate. They're not going to have a successful life. Right? We're off to the races, 0 to 100. What do we want to do in response to impose control and support our kids? We want to teach them. We want to be like, okay, we're going to read for an hour every day. I'm going to teach you. I'm going to be there. And that's a natural response. But for a PDA kid, that intensity of focus and the decision from the parent to be like, this is what we're doing now out of their own anxiety and assumptions about parenting and teaching is going to set off their threat response and make it less likely that they can read, and they'll avoid it. Okay, so this is exactly what happened to me. This is not like a theoretical thing, right? Like my son was out of public school for 1.5 years. When he did go intermittently, he got tested for reading. He was qualified for special education. He was very behind. He wouldn't let me read to him, okay? So I understand this feeling. Our child destroys our things. Like, for example, my hair clips get destroyed all the time. And it's not out of malice or even a panic attack. It's just he likes to take things apart, and he likes the sensory experience of destroying things, right? It's a dopamine thing. And in the moment, I have a surge of being like, I need to teach him not to destroy things because he's never going to be able to operate in the world if he's constantly destroying people's things. And same things with lamps, okay? Or our teen swears at us and we want to say, you can't talk to me like that. We don't use words like this in our home, okay? And these are all natural responses, and they're not the wrong responses, especially if it's working for your family. Like, there is no judgment from me if you're listening to this and you're like, we do that and it works. Great. Absolutely wonderful. Keep doing that. But for most of the people on this session, this live session, we're getting into these vicious power struggles where it's always escalating, where using these more traditional approaches is actually making things much worse. And our children are increasingly not learning or moving into burnout, right? So we have to take a radically different approach, which is hard, okay? So let's take each example and I'll tell you how this looks through the different lens. And this is an experiment, right? Like, if you're not sure, I want to encourage experimentation and observation, right? Because not everything works exactly the same for each PDA child or teen. So how do we let go of teaching in the moment or releasing our attachment and anxiety around teaching skills? Okay, so for reading, a big part of this is letting go of the agenda and the timeline that you have on them reading, because they perceive it and it increases resistance. So what can you do? One of the things that I've done in my home is I've challenged myself imperfectly, not always works, to get off my screen and read a novel near my child on the floor while they're on the iPad, right? To create more of a modeling and a culture of reading. And luckily, me and my husband love reading, but we get into the cycle of like just being on our phones. So that's where I find my agency, for example. The lamps and hair clips, right? Like, we replaced lamps with recessed lighting. And I know that costs money and it's a reflection of my privilege, but I'm just trying to illustrate that, like, instead of doubling down on like, you can't keep destroying our lamps, I set up a more accommodating environment so we weren't getting into these situations. The hair clips, which cost $4, and yes, I don't like wasting plastic or overly consuming. However, it's collateral damage, right? And in the moment, I say, oh my gosh, those things break so easily. I should have put that away, right? Instead of, if you keep breaking that, it's going to be costing me money, or you can't handle it like that because this, to try and teach, like, don't do that, right? Because the natural consequence of the thing breaking is enough for our sensitive kids. Like, they register it if they're in their thinking brain, okay? They don't need us to double down and teach on it, because it just puts them in their threat response and degrades the felt safety that has to precede trust. That is the currency of all collaborative learning that we're trying to move towards, okay? This is a hard one. Parents have a really hard time with this in my programs, on Instagram, all the things. Your teen swears at you. You want to be like, you can't talk to me like that. But if you're raising a PDA kid, what happens? They go further into their survival brain. They may escalate from words into behaviors that are dangerous. And you may be seeing this, right? So we can diffuse, we can ignore it, we can remove ourselves, we can refrain from teaching in the moment, okay? What does this look like day to day? This is very different. Let me give you 3 examples. One's going to be preventative teaching, difficult behavior in the moment teaching, and post-outcome teaching, okay? Preventative. Our kid doesn't want to wear a coat or gloves, and it's freezing out. There's ice on the ground, right? We have 2 choices. We could fight them and try and teach them. We could try and force them and teach them of like, it's cold out. You need to wear this. This is what's going to happen if you don't. If you don't wear your clothes, your hands are going to freeze, right? What is that? Teaching in the moment from a place of I'm the authority without their consent. What happens on a neuroceptive level? Shut down. They can't register what you're saying or learn the lesson. So what can we do, right? With this case, I often just bring the things if we're going to the park, or I make sure to send the coat to school, right? And then there will be a natural consequence, or there won't. They will either feel cold and ask for the coat, which is the learning moment, or they won't, right? But the only chance they have at learning cause and effect is if they're in the part of their brain that can access that, okay? That's a preventative moment where I want to teach, to prevent, okay? Difficult behavior in the moment. You see behaviors that don't reflect the values of your family. And if we're looking at it through a behavioral lens, or if we're thinking about a lot of the parenting expertise out there that I think is great, right? Like, I think a lot of these creators have really brilliant ideas and really compassionate approaches. They're just not for a child with a nervous system disability, right? So if my child was neurotypical and having behaviors that I didn't like, I might correct them, right? But I know from experience of working with hundreds of families, and also from my own lived experience, that if we say, you can't talk like that to me, it escalates because of the logic of their brain, okay? So we want to diffuse and, like I said, ignore, remove oneself, or even, say, yeah, mommy is stupid sometimes. And people really don't like it when I say that. If it triggers you too much, or you have a history of, childhood trauma or relationship trauma, don't experiment with that. That's just something that I do that has really flipped the script. And I don't think of it as like he's going to learn to behave like this, because what? He's not in the part of the brain where he's learning. I'm just doing something to get him back to the frontal lobe, okay, of the brain. Post outcome. This is a low stakes one, but it happens all the time. My son insists on putting his water in a certain place, right? He won't move it away from the edge of the desk. And then he spills it all over and gets upset because he's wet, right? In that moment, what do we want to do? You shouldn't have put your cup there because, like I said or thought, it would spill on you, and now you're upset. But in the moment, their nervous system is already going off. So it degrades the felt sense of safety between you and your child or your teen if you're like, I told you so, or this is why that happened, even though we feel like we should, so that they learn. But remember the brain, what part of the brain they're operating from, okay? So how will they ever learn, right? And do you correct the behavior, Casey, afterwards? Okay, so I get this question all the time. Again, remember, I'm talking about scenarios where it's not with a sibling in the mix, which is adding a whole other can of worms, nuance, and decision making, which is something I teach in the Paradigm Shift program, and it's too nuanced for this particular live session. So just think of this as one-on-one scenarios. Okay, so how will they ever learn? First, we want to, over time, consistently get them to the place where they're below their threshold of tolerance more consistently. If they're in burnout, they're perceiving everything as threat. Okay, they're just past their threshold and everything's setting their nervous system off. Okay, we want to get them to a place where they can observe and access their autodidactic nature, which if you have a younger child who was like mine 5 years ago, and the sponge example, you're like, what do you mean autodidactic? They're not learning anything, right? But trusting that this is a feature of many neurodivergent children, okay? And then instead of explicitly teaching, we want to be modeling for them the values of our home. Okay, so this is sort of like the example I gave with the reading instead of being on my phone, which took effort on my part and still takes effort because often I just want to scrollax. Okay, the question about, oh my gosh, my buzzer's going off for yoga, but I'm going to quickly finish. Okay, so do you discuss it later? 4 or 5 years ago, I did not discuss things later because it was a tenuous moment in the season of our relationship. 2 years ago, I might bring it up in a moment of calm. a couple days later, and now that my son's out of burnout and we have 5 years of a solid relationship, I might bring something up of like, yeah, that was, I didn't like it when you called me stupid. 20 minutes later. But like, in order to get there, I had to spend a year not correcting, right? So that's the paradox. When the behavior is the worst, quote unquote, we need to see it as data of what's going on in their nervous system and realize that we need deeper accommodations, which feels like reinforcing bad behavior. Okay, so I'm only going to use one example here because I'm running out of time, but what does this look like over the long term? Okay, so it's 5 years later. We've never made my child do chores, even though in the back of my mind, I'm like, how is he ever going to learn to cook? How is he ever going to learn to like put his clothes away? How is he going to learn to get his plates from the kitchen? Like, how am I, I have these worries too of like, how am I going to give him independence? And I'm just using this as an illustration. However, over the years, there have been moments when he's observed and seen the culture of other families that I trust and love, like my sisters, where they do chores, right? And he had the opportunity to have that strewed environment to engage of like, oh, they're doing chores, they're earning money, da 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 da. And then, sometimes he'd be like, I want to do chores, and he'd do it for a week and then drop it. And that's okay. But when there is a motivation of like, for example, my son dug a pond in the backyard recently, and he wants to buy a filter for it because he wants to put fish in it because fishing is a special interest. And we said, okay, but you need to earn money in order to do that, or you can use your allowance that he saved up. So he decided, okay, I'm going to do chores. And then we worked collaboratively and talked about his nervous system, where I was like, the things that I think would help me are these. These are the things I think would help you. Which ones do you want to work on? So he chose walk the dog, get my own food for dinner, put silverware in the sink after done using, get my own clothes after shower, add food ideas to grocery list, put our dog's vest and leash on the way to school because we have a service dog, and pack my own lunch. Okay, so all of a sudden, he's gravitating towards the skills and wanting to practice them because he has an end goal in mind. He wants to go to college. And because he wants to earn money to get a filter. He's motivated by a larger goal. Many of our children see through the facade of like, you have to do 10 worksheets on this thing that you already know. Like, our kids are just like, no, right? So when there is motivation, when they're working from the frontal lobe, when we model the values of our family, and when they want, we can offer stewardship and guidance from a place of mentorship, they have a capacity to learn a lot very quickly. Okay, I'm going to stop there. It was a long one, but I hope that supports you in understanding the difference between gentle parenting and caregiving for our very unique children with a nervous system disability, and starts to shift some of your mindset so that you can experiment with a different way of being with your child and see the changes that you observe. All right, everybody, I'm off to yoga. It was nice to see you.